with a few acknowledgements. So this research that I'm going to describe today was funded by the Jack Keating Policy Fund in memory of late Professor Jack Keating, who was a wonderful colleague and a staunch advocate for equity issues. We'd also like to acknowledge our reviewers who provided some advice on the political draft. And I would also like to acknowledge the Indigenous lands on which the work was done. In our case, it's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation on the unceded lands. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. As well as that, of course, I would like to acknowledge the University of Derby for hosting me, my wonderful colleagues at ISEX who've been fantastically welcoming. I've had such a productive couple of weeks. Thank you very much for that, and thank you for hosting this seminar. So I'm going to start with an Australian comedian and journalist called Stella Young. And she sadly passed away a few years ago, but she had a viral TED talk that was entitled, "I'm Not Your Inspiration, Thank You Very Much." And in it, she talked about going to a secondary school to do a teaching placement in legal studies. And she was halfway through, I think it was something on defamation law, and one of her students put up their hand and said, "So when we get to the speech," and she said, I'm sorry, "when we get to the speech, when people come in wheelchairs, it's usually in a big hall and they do something inspirational." And she realised that these students had only really ever seen people with disability as a source of inspiration, but they weren't their doctors, their manicurists, their teachers, their dentists, and so on. And she finished the talk with the line, "I want to live in a world where a kid in year 11 in a Melbourne high school is not one bit surprised that his new teacher is a wheelchair user." So that's kind of our framing of where we see ourselves coming from. So the project, we're looking at how can we increase the diversity of the Australian teacher workforce. It was desktop research, so it was about looking at what are policy initiatives that are around, and also what do we know about retaining teachers from diverse backgrounds. We chose 4 groups, which wouldn't be exactly the same, I think, if you were looking at it from an English perspective. First was students in regional and rural areas. These are hard to staff schools in Australia. They also have problems with achievement. And regional in Australia can be really regional. So we have schools that would be 2 or 3 hours drive from the nearest centre, major town. Indigenous, which, as many of you will be aware, is a very underprivileged group within Australia. Some really major issues there that need to be addressed, and a history of colonialism, racism, and so on. The third group was students from low SES backgrounds. And finally, people with disability. Now, there are other groups that are underrepresented within the teaching workforce. We decided to focus on those for a couple of reasons. We want to focus on groups where we know there's an ongoing link with low achievement, and where there seems to be some evidence that matching is likely to raise that achievement. We do acknowledge 2 things. One is that there's intersectionality between these groups. So Indigenous kids are also more likely to be rural and regional, but also more likely to have a CS background. And there are those overlapping factors that can multiply. We also acknowledge the role of achievement in that these are groups that have traditionally performed at lower than average levels. And of course, this does affect the pool of people who achieve at the sort of standard that will allow them to move into a teaching degree. So, as well as the types of initiatives that I'll talk about on the way through, we do have to continue that work to raise achievement, but we see these things as linked. Disability is a really complex one because, of course, the definitions vary. We took it as our definition in the Australian government definition of disability. So lasted or likely to last 6 months or more, physical, mental, sensory, psychosocial, and other forms of disability. We also acknowledge that disability is in part created by the systems and structures around us, and that it has to do as much with what we provide as a society as to how that disability or that different ability actually impacts. So we take a psychosocial, emotional view of disability in our work. So, brief summary here of the current Australian teaching workforce. So at the top you can see that, and we had to go with whatever data was available. So you can see population is P or workforce population, depending on what was available, and percentage of teacher workforce or ITE completions, depending on again what was available. So disability is clearly underrepresented. Not born in Australia is another underrepresented category. Indigenous, again underrepresented. Men are another underrepresented group in teaching. LGBTIQ, we just don't have the data, so we don't actually know whether that is an underrepresented group. Sadly, in Australia, it is still legal in some non-government schools to discriminate against LGBTIQ people, so I think we need to get honest data from anyone anyway in that particular case. Low socioeconomic, we know as well, below figure population, and rural and regional is also represented. This is the British data, English data, sorry. And again, the figures vary considerably. This is from Jerome and included mental illness within it. So DFE is very low indeed for people with disability. Ethnic minorities underrepresented, men underrepresented, and LGBTIQ and low socioeconomic status. I couldn't find any data. I'm not sure what the issues are. My guess is that if it's anything like most developed countries, you will have the same sorts of issues. I didn't include rural and regional because they're not your lower achieving children from what I can see from the data in England. So why does teacher workforce diversity matter? So the first finding, and a lot of this research is not all, but quite a bit is from the states where there's been a long-standing interest in increasing the number of teachers of colour in the workforce. There is evidence around increased achievement, and there are a couple of mechanisms that are believed to underlie this. First is that there's a role modelling effect, that students are seeing someone like them in a position of leadership and strong level of academic achievement and so on. Second matter is that they help students navigate structures and cultures that might feel unfamiliar to them and that don't necessarily always make sense. There's considerable evidence now that they tend to have higher expectations. In the US, a black teacher is more likely to nominate black students for gifted education programs than a white teacher. And they're less likely to suspend them or put them on detention programs and will reason their way through an issue with behaviour. So they tend to have higher expectations, and there's a wealth of research that tells us that students respond to expectations. If your teacher expects that you'll do well, your achievement and your motivation tend to rise. They also tend to build relationships with our groups in the community, so they will become a person who parents feel comfortable. Parents from that particular minority group will feel comfortable about talking to, a bit more relaxed. They build understanding of cultural issues both within their student group by saying, oh, well, have you thought about it from this type of perspective? And also across the staff. So they, if you like, help educate a little bit more the rest of the staff on some of those issues. They tend to promote positive attitudes towards the group across the school community. And finally, there's not in teaching, but generally there's quite a lot of work on organisations generally that says that more diverse organisations tend to be more productive, they get a better range of ideas, there's groupthink and so on. So that's all the background on why that might matter. There's also a small but growing body of research on teachers with disability. They will tend to have higher empathy for students with disability. They will often have a greater capacity to differentiate because they have, through their own experience, learned different ways they've needed to work around with things. They will often use new pedagogical approaches, and they definitely promote positive attitudes across the school towards disability and the role models to the students. So there's a really good range of growing research that explains why this is a really important thing to do. So our questions were, what has been done in the way of policy initiatives? Are there initiatives that are specifically targeted to increasing the diversity of the workforce? How effective are they? And I'll give a heads up here. I was at a talk at the Bureau conference in Edinburgh from Durham University, who's also working in this space. And he said, there aren't a lot of evaluations. Policymakers often put things in place, and there's not a lot of serious research to determine exactly how effective it is. So we did want to try and pull together as much research as we could on whether these various initiatives were effective. We argued that no point bringing people in if you can't retain them. So what does the research literature tell us about workplaces that support retention? And finally, what are the lessons that we can have for policymakers and institutions? So we chose a number of jurisdictions, and obviously we had limited time and personnel, so we kept it as neatly as we could. So we had Australian departments of education. We have the ludicrous situation in a country with 26 million people that we have 6 states and 2 territories, and they all have their own departments of education. So we pulled through their various websites on scholarships and ways to get into teaching. We did several Canadian jurisdictions. We looked at the DFES and had a look at what their website said, and we chose the 3 most popular states in the United States. The reason we chose this is that larger education systems have more economies of scale and can tend to offer more in terms of a variety of ways into teaching. We also did literature searches on attributes of workplace support minority employees and articles on creating educational sites that support minority teachers. We generally found that there were 3 groups. So one was targeted initiatives, and that was actually the smallest. So initiatives that are targeted directly at making sure that you increase the diversity. There were semi-targeted ones where diversity might be one of the names. And then there were inadvertent. So the inadvertent were ones that, for example, you have trips to teachers in the United States. You've had that here. You've got a new initiative that has replaced that. It's not targeted at people with disability, but it's likely to pull people with disability in because one of the key reasons that people move out of the armed forces is because they've had some sort of injury that means they can't continue working with the armed forces. So what did we find? First one was grow your own, and these are probably the most common one in the United States. So these are teaching recruitment initiatives that target people who are already working in school, so they might be teachers' aides or whatever. They provide support, financial and otherwise, so they often have mentoring programs and so on. They offer payment, often they have counselling, professional learning, networks, groups, all those sorts of things, and they generally work on internship models. So that is you teach and you pay simultaneously. And go through. There are numerous grow your own programs that have been running for quite a long time. I think the oldest one we found was about 1981 in the United States. So they have been around for a long time. They work on a couple of parts of reason. One is that local people understand the culture, they're attached to the local community, they're likely to be placed there. And that's the aim, that they will be placed back in their local community and that they'll be placed there for the teaching. And of course, because they're working in a school, they've got some sort of background understanding, there's some sort of interest in education. They go on a spectrum. So you have some, the New South Wales Department of Education has just started one that is just about getting teacher aides into teaching. There's no particular diversity focus in it. It's about solving the teacher shortage, which we have in the same way that you do. You have others, and the strongest one in the United States tend to see diversity and local knowledge as something that should be informing ITE, that this diversity is strength and they actually influence the teaching program. So it's not just okay, here's our standard teaching program, we'll support you go through them. There's an element of joint design and consultation that goes all the way through. And they tend to be the strongest. Con reduced in the states and a lot of exceptions. Overall, in terms of the evidence, they tend to have a positive impact on workforce diversity and they tend to have high retention. And retention in the schools where they're needed, the schools that are typically hard to study. They're the ones for which we found the strongest research evidence for effectiveness. Teacher residencies and internships. I should explain too that it's actually quite hard to classify these. Often they've got elements of each other. So teacher residency, internships and so on, teach actively while training and get paid. There are quite a few of those. You've got some in England. Teach Forward, Teach First is a long-standing one that's been around since the 80s. Postgraduate teacher apprenticeships and so on. Usually, again, these are aimed at supply issues. They're not particularly aimed at diversity. I was extremely proud to find that in my own state, we had the only initiative that was specifically designed for people with disability. We have a shortage of vocational education teachers in the school, so teaching carpentry and building and all those sorts of things. And we have a pilot program at the moment that is targeting people from the trades who have some sort of disability that's been developed usually through their work in the trades to essentially an internship into teaching. So again, a wide variety there. The evidence on these is mixed. So mixed with regard to retention. I may not, maybe shouldn't say this to someone who ran the Teach for Australia program at Melbourne University back in 2012-13, but the Teach For programs don't always have wonderful retention. There's been some question marks over that. Mixed evidence on student achievement. They're mostly targeted at supply, but because diverse groups tend to be, particularly say, for example, low SES, the whole issue of being able to earn a wage while you're currently studying can address some of the barriers. So for some of those underrepresented groups, the fact that you move straight into a classroom will support, and you're earning a wage while you're doing so, will potentially support them to gain qualification in line with otherwise. So some other promising options. One was high school teaching academies, and these are where you take high school students in years 10, 11, 12, so the same last 3 years of school. And they spend some time going to local schools, teaching little lessons, children group and so on. And they're built all the way through in the last couple of years of school to help them decide whether or not they want to move towards teaching. We couldn't find any evaluations. There's a few of those in the States. We couldn't find evaluations. IT scholarships targeting diversity. So, for example, in Australia, we have Indigenous targeted scholarships. Mixed evidence as to how effective they are, not really 100% clear. There's also a question about whether sometimes scholarships get people in, but they don't retain them. Debt forgivenesses and signing bonuses sometimes used. Housing support's been tried in the United States. We also have, it's not targeted towards diversity, but we have housing support in Australia for some of our rural and remote schools, housing provided to staff, because there's really not much in the area. Another one, and I was talking with Alison about this, but the articulation between further education and ITV, that there are programs that are starting to increase the ease with which a person can move across between a VET course, or what we call VET course, further education course at TAFE, and into an IT program. So smoothing out that articulation, that often for students who may, for example, be first in family, it's less of a cultural leap, and it's also less of a financial leap to undertake something at a local further education provider. And sometimes geographically, particularly in Australia, that can be easier as well. So increasing articulation and recognition between systems and so on may help as well. Shifting hurdle requirements. In Australia, we have a hurdle test for our teachers called the land type, literacy and numeracy teacher, something like that, initial for teacher education, that must be passed, and students have to pay to sit it. Some of you may have heard of something called stereotype threat, that when somebody feels that they're not, or their group is not good at something, they will tend to underperform. So it's interesting if you tell women, for example, that, and this is simplifying thing, but if you tell women that this particular maths test that women do just as well on as men, they will tend to. They sometimes underperform on other tests. Now, in the same way, hurdle requirements may be threatening for people from minority backgrounds, where they have a perception, or there's a broader perception that perhaps people like them are not very good at these types of things. And it's a question of, is there another way to do this? Is there another way to assess these types of skills without a formal written test? So what about once they're in? I believe people should read that, right? It needs an explanation. So we wanted to understand what are some of the factors that might help in terms of retaining these teachers. Is they move into a school and it feels foreign and they feel out of place, or the structures, whether physical or other social, to support them aren't there, we won't keep them. So it's important to create workplaces that sustain and retain teachers from minority groups, and I've included here again, this is my home state, but they now have an inclusive workplace guide for schools that's about being inclusive, not for students, but for teachers. So how do we ensure that people from these groups feel a part of our schools, feel valued, and feel that their diversity contributes to the quality of the school? So these are some of the things we found from the literature. First of all, the focus should be on systems and structures, not on individuals. If people feel that individuals are picked out for behaving badly, it won't shift the systemic things that are actually usually the main problem. Second one is inclusion training or unconscious bias training. And obviously that depends on to some degree on whether you have local hiring and firing. We do in Victoria. So unconscious bias training can be really important. Mentoring and induction right through to leadership. Involvement of the school leadership in terms of support, Communities of mutual support. I noted that your union, for example, has communities for LGBTIQ plus teachers. Our Victorian Department has a network for teachers with disabilities to support one another, share issues, and so on. A designated diversity and inclusion person staff role can help raise the profile of the issue. And finally, the importance with disability that disclosure risk of the person. And the same, of course, obviously with sexuality. But it's important that people retain their agency in all of this. Danger, outgroup overload. There's a phenomenon that has been noted in the literature that it can be very easy when somebody comes in and they're from a minority group. Came across an excellent article by an Indigenous teacher who talked about turning up at school and suddenly, oh, you're responsible for Indigenous Week, and can you talk to all the Indigenous parents, and can you train us all culturally, and so on. And there is evidence that minority teachers in the workforce find this very unfair. They're usually not given any recognition or salary loading for it, and they're expected, in a sense, to be the representative of that group. And those of us who are a little bit older will remember when this was often a really big issue for women who made it to very similar positions, that they were the outgroup person. So we did also include in our report a warning to be wary of outgroup overload and not to place all the burdens on a person's shoulders if they come in as a member of a minority group. As well as that, of course, we have a teaching staffing crisis, as does England at the moment. And these are some of the general things that probably don't raise any eyebrows at all, that would be obvious, as to what needs to happen to try and help retain teachers. So sustaining teachers in the workforce, they need leadership support. They need to feel like they've got some agency and some decision making. Teacher autonomy supports their potential. You want to keep teachers out, then tell them exactly what they have to teach, when and how. And a reasonable workload. So some other findings. One of the things we found was that there was an overwhelming emphasis on supply issues. So there did not seem to be in any of the jurisdictions much, probably a little bit more in the United States, but for the most part, there was no broad vision of what is the type of teaching workforce we would really like to have. It was, let's get in there and fill the gaps. And while we are in the middle of a staffing crisis, I've been looking at staffing policy for about 15 years now, and I can tell you that 15 years ago, it was the same. It was all about filling staffing gaps rather than some sort of vision. And I liken it to a game of musical chairs where, for the most part, if the chairs are teaching jobs, we've had more people up until recently than we've had chairs. And policymakers have suddenly got to come to terms with the fact that we now have more chairs than people, and we need to think about what is it about teaching as a job that we can make it as attractive as we possibly can to as broad a group of people as we possibly can. A second thing, in terms of some of the discourse around all of this is from Eric Hanashek, who's a professor of educational economics at Harvard. And he came up with this chart. And if we take out bottom 5% of teachers in terms of their ability to raise outcomes, and we place them all with an average teacher, we'd end up, you know, the US would be up there with Finland in our educational results. And so this has kind of gone the rounds a little bit. And it's a very, apart from the fact that we won't find a whole lot of teachers to replace that bottom 5%, it's a very individualistic conception of what teaching quality is about. We also have schools in the United States where they're currently using student results to determine teacher pay, which is again about this notion that you've got this teacher as the individual, and that's what determines everything in the classroom. And it's also there in, if you like, in some of our heroic teaching tropes in culture. Here's the teacher who comes in and turns everything around, but it's about individuals. And we wanted to argue that we need to move from this notion of individual quality teachers to a quality teaching workforce. And we argue that it has these components. It's founded on a quality social and policy ecosystem where teaching is valued, where parents value teaching, where the teacher's work is respected, where our politicians speak highly of teaching. I think England probably has as far to go as we do on this in this regard, where it has quality working conditions that can compete. Teaching is a job in a labour market where there are other options for talented individuals. And we need to think about what are the working conditions we offer teachers that to make it competitive. Needs on top of that, quality IT preparation and professional learning. And then we need to build this notion of diversity into our concept of quality, that a quality teaching workforce is both capable but also diverse. So our additional recommendations in the report were that there needs to be some sort of vision about where things are going. There is also much better data needed, both in Australia but in the systems we looked at overseas as well. But often we don't have a lot of information about where our teachers are from and so on. And if we're going to strive to build the diverse teaching workforce, we need much better data. We also talked about the fact that class often seems to be invisible in the data. So we'll talk about rural and regional kids, and we will talk about class when it comes to student achievement, but not in terms of teachers. And there's also a need for much more research in this area. It's really just starting out as a field. So in terms of the sorts of things we're interested in doing in next steps for research, we're interested in spending some more time. Some of it has been done talking to current minority teachers, part of their family experience, what's sustaining them, what's drawing them down. Minority IT students for their experiences within courses and in schools. We'd like to talk to young people in schools from minority groups in terms of, okay, do they see themselves as a teacher? If not, why not? What is it about teaching? They're in there in the classroom. What is it about teaching that doesn't appeal to them, or that means they cannot see themselves as part of that classroom? And finally, we do need to think about attitudes and concerns in schools and ways to address these. So are there principal concerns, for example, about having a teacher with disability in their workforce? How might we go about addressing them? So the report that we're producing, I have hoped to have hard copies here. It is coming out on Monday. I returned to Australia on Friday. It's coming out on Monday, and I will send the link through. It's called Seeing Ourselves at School. And yeah, that will be launched on Monday by the faculty. And discussion. Any questions, thoughts, comments from people?
Quite reassuring to see that you're experiencing very many of the same challenges we have here, and which the recruitment and representation for the slow, it's not so slow erosion of the teacher autonomy and teacher autonomy, in a way that teachers don't feel in every more prescribed landscape, but therefore is better and is valued, and therefore why better would you want to put yourself through that with your graduate degree when other jobs are more attractive and less.
Yes, yeah, and that whole years ago when I did my PhD, and I was looking at teaching movement and attraction and retention of high quality teachers, and one of the things that came out of some of the United States research was that, in fact, high quality teachers wanted autonomy was even more important to them than less effective teachers. So if you really want to kick them out of the system, tell them that they have to do X on this day and X on that day, and you have to follow this strict curriculum and so on. So yeah. Come on.
I think that just sort of building on what Alison saying, there's so many similarities across a number of public sector careers. I mean, everything there is, we've seen it out in every sector as well. We're doing some really interesting work around diversity within that. One of the things that came out of the event we were at last year was around the retention. And that there were a lot, and you've alluded to this already, there were lots of strategies to encourage people to come in. But once they were in, the barriers came up, and it didn't seem to be, that diversity didn't seem as important in terms of support, career progression, development, promotion, all of those type of things. That's sort of one point, whether you've got any thoughts on that. And then the other, when you showed the stats at the beginning around, you know, the groupings, and within teaching, you know, and again, this varies in the gender breakdown between men and women. If you look at the stats around leadership, they're different kettle of fish. So there's lots of layers within this, aren't there? That isn't just, you know, in or out, so to speak, in terms of you're in teaching or you're moving out.
Yeah. Now, with the first one, I had a chapter I wrote with a couple of colleagues a few years ago, and we did a policy scan of Australian policies 2016, I think. And we argued that attraction places the most pressure on policymakers. You don't have someone who have headlines all over the newspapers saying schools without teachers and kids left in classroom and double class sizes and all this sort of thing. Retaining teachers doesn't create anywhere near the same sort of policy pressure, and retaining them in hard to staff sites creates even less. So that, for example, we have major issues with some of our most remote schools in retaining teachers during the time, a long way out into the outback. There are lots and lots of incentives to get them in. There are far fewer to get them there. There are some, and some jurisdictions have been quite creative. South Australia has a lead program. If you've been in the school for 4 years, you get a semester off to go and do professional learning. These are really, really remote schools. There's a way out in the back bush. So there are some sort of potential there, but it's less of a pressure point. And again, when you look at the policy scan we did this time, it's still about this whole supply issue. It's still about how do we fill the gaps so that, you know, the minister's not in trouble with press on Monday morning and answering a whole lot of questions about someone who's just paying attention. It does create pressure. Retention is a bigger issue. Teacher satisfaction is a bigger issue until it gets sort of with the ground moment. So I think it does become a big issue. So yeah, I think that's yeah. The other point you make too about, and I don't know quite how we solve that. It was, you know, there's the direct line from government policymakers to us and to schools. Yeah, and it really isn't. The pressure just isn't there in quite the same way. And unfortunately, our hard to staff schools tend to be the schools where parents don't have the type of social capital that will let them create merry hill. That in a more middle class or upper middle class school might do. The second point you made about variation within groups, it was one of the reasons we stayed away from men. And we stayed away from non-English speaking backgrounds. So in Australia, we've got, with men, we have fewer men in teaching, but they're overrepresented in positions of authority. And NESB, non-English speaking backgrounds, that we use in Australia, we've got a real mix. So we've got some groups, say refugee groups, where the kids are really struggling in terms of achievement. There are all sorts of issues in terms of sometimes having to go out and work to earn money for the family. We have other non-English speaking groups that are doing extremely well. So it's a much more And that's where the whole Christian intersectionality comes from. It's
Yeah.
fine, but it's a really complex one in terms of assessing whether or not this is an issue that needs to be addressed fully. It's more of an issue, I suspect, from listening to people talking, in terms of getting people of colour into teaching places. So.
I think I was going to say I'm involved in an NHS project that is looking at recruitment and diversity within public health professions. It's just the same discussion across the board. There's, we're all having the same discussions. And in the meeting I was in yesterday, they were talking about the challenges particularly about migrant workers, refugees, asylum seekers who are coming in highly qualified but not being able to progress in for a whole range of reasons. But also, one of the things that I really struggle with the meeting is about the challenges in that there are jobs, but actually it's the jobs that don't need, that require a master's degree, for example, in public health, are attracting doctoral candidates. So the qualification levels are going up, which means that people who might lack experience and are actually relatively have the right qualifications can't get in because there's too many other people who've got higher qualifications. So I suppose the point I'm making is that there's a lot of complexity here, and it's in a lot of areas, particularly public sector funded areas.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I've gone through fairly quickly and I have understated over the top of some of that complexity because it's not straightforward and there's a lot there. Kristen, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering whether you had any evidence on, so anecdotally, it seems like teaching careers are getting shorter. That people are, whereas people would spend their whole career or a very large portion of it in teaching, it's now pretty common for people to leave. I just wonder whether that's backed up by data.
I'm not absolutely 100% sure on this. My understanding is that in general, that's the case with everyone's jobs, that people are the turnover's greater. I think Richard Ingersoll's done a bit on this in the United States, where he's found that the teaching workforce is getting younger and more female, and I think the career was shorter. So I'll check that out for you. But yeah, I think it is. And this notion that we go through a number of different careers in lifetime. Certainly the number of career changes, my understanding from career changes into teaching is going up as well.
So that was what for them.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's two possibilities on it. One is that teaching is getting teaching careers are getting shorter at a faster rate than everything else, and that's probably some of the things Siobhan was just talking about, is that people have not got, it's not good work, it's not well paid, it's not giving people what it used to give. But the other possibility is that there's just great switching around.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
if that was the case, then you would expect that to be matched by equal numbers of people coming in, so mid-career changes coming into teaching, which obviously does happen, but seems to be not at the sort of volume that we're losing people out of teaching.
It's probably not at the moment, but having said that, one of the things we do know about teaching is that, and I've done research and with colleagues that will show you, and ask people why they go into teaching, and I'll say, oh, it's someone to help students grow and help people flourish and so on. But we also know from the educational economists that even though people don't say, oh, the teaching is that like career and so on, that when the external labour market improves, teaching applications go down. So it's possible at the moment that that's partly a reflection of that. We've got a strong labour market, with big demand skills, and lawyers are crying out, I think, Western Australia, civil here, isn't it? Yeah. So we're going to struggle more with teaching in that context, even though, as I said, people will tell you that it's not a backup career and all those sorts of things. Clearly, some definitely massaging responses a little bit. So yes, I think that's part of what's coming to play at the moment. But certainly, in terms of career changes, this is semi-anecdotal. Our average age of students coming into our teaching careers in Melbourne has gone up considerably. No, even masters, but it used to be sort of 2 or 3 after the bachelor's degree. I think we're now about an average bachelor again. So, and there are more and more courses that are taken for the trainers, like that is the shift that's something. And I would actually argue we need to start thinking about how do we perhaps design schools to cope with maybe a core of ongoing staff who have a long-term commitment and this sort of fluidity in and out in a way that generates some sort of stability for students and some sort of sense of shared culture, but allows that flow in and out. Because I don't think we really thought that one through with all intention. What response?
I'll take you back to you. I think you really can't. I don't see anyone put questions online. Council.
Oh, okay. Are there questions online?
No, check.
Okay, thanks.
You mentioned something about being not being illegal to have LGBTQI. I lost it. Given my hearing of it, but that seems to be a consistent thing. We've got the Equality Act in 2010. I wonder if you had something similar in Australia that would overcome at least some of those issues, because it won't be confined just to that simply the demographic and LGBTQI. You really couldn't translate to race, ethnicity, religion, etc.
Okay, so, and Christian knows I get very kind of a cold when I talk about this, but we have a strange education system in Australia in that we have around about 2/3 of our students educated in government schools. We had a very close parental choice government that came in 1996, and they started all these policies to encourage the establishment of non-government schools. And so we have 66% in our government schools. I think it's 21 in our Catholic schools and the remainder in independent schools. They now form a very significant group and they get, the Catholic schools, for example, get almost the same funding per student as the state schools, but can discriminate against students and teachers. And they, as a lobby group, will argue for discrimination, that you have to be able to fulfil the ethos of this particular school system. So the Catholics and Independents push the government, and we have exceptions to the Anti-Discrimination Act that allow them to, for example, sack a teacher who's gay, who comes out as gay.
Say again, sorry.
It allows them to sack a teacher who comes out as gay.
How can you challenge legislation like that? Because that, if we've got look at just these valuable about children. The Equality Act transcends all of that. Like what? This is fascinating.
Yeah, and
This might be the answer to the question.
and I mean, it's just a crazy situation, but
Wow, it's 2023.
yeah, that's what I could think about this.
I think the distinction between the grow your own approach and the teach for kind of approach is quite interesting, worth saying a bit more about, because it seems to me that, but the challenge to that will be that when you're getting people who you're growing your own, you're getting people who have often done not particularly well at the end of high school and so on, and you're then trying to develop them. Whereas at least the claim of those teaching programs are like very high.
We're up to it.
And is there any evidence that actually makes much of a difference in terms of
Achievement?
So yeah, so basically are people who go in, who've come through the elite, as opposed to people who are really embedded in their communities and have got a long-standing commitment to education. Which are better teachers? Is there any difference? I suppose.
I don't know of any evidence comparing the two. The Teach For groups, umbrella, have never claimed that they're getting people into teaching for the long term. So there is evidence on retention that the Grow Your Own is very good on keeping people in, not just getting them in. Teach For Australia is often marketing itself to groups as sort of, this is a great career step for you. And there is quite a bit of evidence from overseas that retention rate's not great after 5 to 10 years for sexual candidates. So I am being recorded.
Years seems to be the benchmark in the UK, isn't it, around how long?
Yeah, it's really terrifying that, but then to go for a training will help in the first 2 years because if you invested in 1 year early, that's particularly less likely to bail. But thereafter will be interesting when it happens with that side of one else. We want to be able to, but that's worked a lot for another year or so.
Is anyone doing any research on that?
Yes, I understand.
Who is it?
All right, well, I think that's that. Questions. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. I've really enjoyed sharing my research with you, and I will send the link through to the report. Just as I said, comes out on Monday, and if you've got any questions, feel free to email them through. I'll make